Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. I'm Nick Barris. It is Tuesday. Is it Tuesday? No, it's, wow, time flies. It's Wednesday. You know what it's like when you get back from the holidays and you're trying to roll through things. Listen, it's good to be back, and we've got another live show this morning. We're going to open up the phone lines for you and invite you to join in the conversation. It's our regular segment that we talk about what happens to you with your doctor, your hospital, whether or not you might have a legal case if you're not pleased with the way something went. And we're going to go over all the basics as we always do with our guest this morning, but the key on this is you would be surprised. Every time he comes on, I hear about cases and I'm like, oh my gosh, do I even want to go get medical care these days? Fortunately, you know, there are a lot of good doctors out there, but there's sometimes you need to take them to task, and that's why you need malpractice attorneys like Clint Kelly. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning and Happy New Year, Nick.
Happy New Year. It's good to see you.
Good to see you,
Here we
too.
are, 2016 on a Wednesday, and it's good to have you here.
Right.
Listen, the number's up on the screen, 737-7587, but let's let you know a little bit more, especially we get new viewers just kicking in with the beginning of the new year and all of that. You're a malpractice attorney.
That's correct.
That's your specialty.
That's right, certified specialist.
Again, malpractice would be the definition of what?
The physician is negligent or a healthcare provider is negligent, and that negligence caused severe catastrophic injury to a patient.
Okay. Now, throughout life, and you probably know people out there, or maybe yourself, you've left after a procedure or something, maybe things didn't go right. You wonder, how do I know whether or not I have a case or not? I mean, now, let's be clear. Doctors aren't miracle workers. They can't, just because you don't get cured doesn't mean you have a case, correct?
That's correct.
So what's the line? If you would, right now, just as a primer at the top, and the phone lines are already coming in now, but how does someone know if they perhaps have a case?
Well, the first thing you're going to have is you're going to have a really bad outcome.
Can you give me an example of something? You've handled hundreds of cases, but give me an example of something.
Well, the most obvious case people would be familiar with is if a physician or hospital removes the wrong organ or removes the wrong body part. You know, you've heard stories about patients losing arms or legs or eyes because the patients were mixed up. That's the most obvious example. But other examples would be where a patient goes to an emergency room with chest pain and is misdiagnosed with having indigestion, and the next day the patient dies from a massive heart attack. Or situations in surgery where there is what doctors call a misadventure, where they botch the surgery and the patient either dies from the surgery, or like we've talked about Joan Rivers before, where a patient dies from a fairly simple procedure of an endoscopy because they didn't have the proper life support equipment available. So those are the typical types of injuries that you'll see. So that's the first thing you need. But the second thing you need is you need an expert to look at the case, another doctor or other healthcare provider to say, this is wrong, this is what they call a departure from the standard of care.
Standard of care.
In our language, we call it, it's a bad mistake and it should not have happened. And they say because of that, this injury occurred and it could have been prevented.
The good example you gave about showing up at the hospital with a heart condition but being misdiagnosed, and you go home and have a heart attack the next day. Now, if they come back and look and say, well, no, they did the proper EKGs, they did everything they could, and it just didn't show and you went home and died, they may not have a case. But if you went in and all they said is, oh, that's indigestion, here, take an antacid, and sent you home without doing further checking, and a doctor looks at it, one of your experts, and says, they didn't live up to the standard of care. Based on the symptoms, you should have done these other things and you didn't. That's how you clarify maybe you have a case.
That's correct. Or, you know, we talked about a bad outcome. You may have a bad outcome and there's no real negligence involved. I mean, I've had many situations where patients will have abdominal surgery and they'll have their bowels nicked or an organ nicked during the course of the procedure, and that does not mean the doctor was negligent, because in some cases that's what they call a risk of the procedure. And in other cases, a patient may have a bad outcome and the doctor did everything the doctor could do, and as you said, they're not miracle workers. There is a certain degree of hazard involved in medicine, and so it really takes convincing evidence that there was a medical mistake and convincing evidence or substantial evidence that the injury is going to be in my opinion, catastrophic or severe in order to take the case.
Aside from conduct of doctors or hospitals, you also get involved in cases maybe where a treatment or a medication doesn't work properly?
That's correct, or where it's misprescribed.
Well, we did the one on the birth control device that migrated in the woman. We've done stories together on some of his more high-profile cases.
Right.
Something like that, or a medicine. You've done some class action stuff?
We've done some class action work on medications that have had really awful side effects that were not were not described to the patient before the patient agreed to the medication. I've had cases where the wrong medication was given to a patient and the patient was injured, and that happens more often than you think. The misdiagnosis cases, those are a large share of our cases, Nick, because I don't know why, but for some reason there tends to be a rush to judgment in some cases, like, the heart attack is the most obvious example, where patients are misdiagnosed where they should have been diagnosed properly and they have terrible outcomes from it. So probably I would say there's a wide variety of different injuries, but the key part is the injuries must be severe, in my opinion, in order for juries to want to compensate in these cases.
And one other note before we start opening up the phone calls, actually two. One, I wanted to say, we've had people call into this show requesting and asking about a situation. Clint's heard it, and we've actually done stories on him, and then you ended up getting a case. The most recent one was an individual at a hospital who went in, and you say some cases are more open and shut than others, and this was where he went in for treatment of a lacerated arm. And what did they spray, Clint?
They sprayed furniture disinfectant, which is called Cavicide, into his arm. And if you'll recall, there are mistakes, Nick, and there are bad mistakes.
Right.
And that was a bad mistake. It's just no defense to it at all.
This cleanser somehow got in the rack with the other medicines, and they grabbed the cleanser, which gave him burns on top of the wound.
Chemical burns on top of his laceration. Didn't just grab it once, grabbed it multiple times, and for whatever reason didn't discover the error. And those are the types of things that, and we can explain this as we go along in the show, but it's in modern medicine and the way hospitals are being run these days, those types of mistakes are becoming more prevalent, at least in my experience.
One other note real quick before we get to the phone calls. If you're sitting there thinking, maybe I have something I want to check on, but I'm too busy to get to it, there is a statute of limitations on these cases. Clint has had cases come through the door that are rock solid gold, and he says, when did this happen? Oh, 2 years ago? Out of luck. Go ahead on that.
In Tennessee, the statute of limitations is 1 year from the date of the injury or 1 year from date of discovery of the injury, whichever comes later. The bottom line, what I tell everyone is, if you think you've been injured or a relative has been injured, do not wait. Call a lawyer, call me. It's always free. Consultation does not cost anything. And if it turns out there's no case, then you've lost nothing. But if there is a case and there's a serious injury and you wait too long, then your case may be time barred, meaning you cannot sue. And that's devastating to a family or a patient who actually has a meritorious case, should get their day in court, and they won't because they waited too late.
Yeah, it costs absolutely nothing to call. And we'll have Clint's contact information up at the end of the program. And we should say that he only gets paid if you win your case, which means you are picky about your cases because they're very expensive cases to try.
Very much so. I mean, they can cost up to $100,000 to try, and so we have to be very careful in the cases that we take and invest in, because you really can't afford to lose too many cases. You have to do something else.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got the ground rules for you. We can cover more bases, but we've got several calls already coming in. Lines open, 737-7587. Doesn't cost you anything to call us now, especially. So let's go to Julie. Good morning, Julie.
Good morning.
Hey.
How are you guys doing?
Good.
Great. Listen, based on what I was just listening to, it doesn't sound like my particular situation rises to the level of legal claim. However, I guess my comments will be a caveat.
Sure.
Folks listening. I went to Vanderbilt Medical Center over a period of about 2 or 2.5 years, complaining of UTI-type symptoms, which would be urinary tract infection-type symptoms. But the doctor never did she wasn't able to diagnose a simple thing like that. And what happened is I kept going back because the symptoms kept recurring. And I think on one occasion I went to an alternative doctor there because the regular doctor was not available on that day. And I think she gave me a 5-day course of antibiotics, just a generic situation. But the symptoms returned. And so what ended up happening after about 2 years of this, I ended up having one of my flanks, which is your left or right side, sort of fail, such that I couldn't walk, and I had to get emergency, and ended up in emergency there, and was diagnosed with a bladder infection. The UTI had changed into that, which was very serious because it could if the infection had gotten to my bloodstream, I could have probably died. So I was wondering, is that type of negligence actionable?
When did this happen?
Okay, so you said 2 to 3 years. When did it happen, or when did you initially become aware of it, or
Right.
Well, what happened was I started, say it was sometime in 2012, maybe the late summer.
Okay.
And I was going back and forth, and and I never had this ever happened in my whole life, that a doctor could not diagnose, or the lab did not diagnose the UTI. And so I would do things myself, there's certain things, drink a lot of water and use lemon juice or whatever to try to see if I could flush it out. But the symptoms continued to come back, and so I would go back and forth. And for some reason, this doctor just was not able to diagnose a simple UTI, and it ended up 2 years later, in June of 2014, my left failed, and I couldn't walk, and I was able to get EMS out there to take me in to the emergency room, and the doctor diagnosed a blood infection, serious one, because it started to affect the cords.
Sure. Yeah, I can see how that would get dangerous. All right, so what do you think? She may be right. It sounds like it's outside the statute of limitations.
Yeah, Julie is the unfortunate example of what we were just talking about, which is I think that the likely analysis would be that she knew or should have known in June of 2014 that something happened to her as a result of wrongful medical conduct, and that's when the clock starts ticking, and that's why we just got to keep hammering this, Nick, that when people think that's happened to them, like in Julie's case, just pick up the phone and call. It costs Julie nothing to call and get an opinion. Whether this injury is related to the UTI, it sounds like it is. It's hard to tell the extent of her damages because we didn't get too deep in that, but this is why you have to call when you think something's happened to you, because once that year goes by, we're already, in January of 16. Right. I'd tell Julie the same thing I would tell someone else in the situations. I can't review your case because your case is time barred.
Now, beyond that, let's just say this wasn't time barred. You would then, if you took on this case, have to look and see exactly what it was her doctor did to try to diagnose this. And if she didn't do the basic test to look for a urinary tract infection, that would be probably not doing the proper standard of care. Now, I can't imagine this doctor wouldn't have done some basic testing of that.
Well, usually they will do a urinalysis to determine whether or not there's a urinary tract infection. That should reveal evidence of an infection if that's what she has. But what I would do, the first thing I would do is get Julie to sign what we call a HIPAA form. That's just a medical authorization. And send that authorization to Vanderbilt, and then Vanderbilt will respond by sending me Julie's records, and then I would have Julie's records reviewed by whoever the doctor is, whether it's an internal medicine doctor or a gynecologist, but someone to look at it and say whether or not this doctor misdiagnosed her UTI and whether the doctor should be held accountable for it.
Gotcha. Sorry you had to go through that, Julie, and I appreciate you calling because it could be a cautionary tale for someone else. Listen, we've got to take a break on that one. When we come back, the lines are up, 737-7587. If you have a question or comment, just like Julie's, or a condition or something that maybe could have a legal recourse, give us a call. Darlene, Randy, and others, if you're on the hold, stay there. We'll get to you when we come back right after this.